The silk scarves had no business on a frontier trading post table. Handwoven, the color of persimmons and river stones, laid out where most folk had never seen the ocean, let alone crossed it. The woman behind them was the only one of her kind for 300 miles, a Japanese widow selling the last thing she had to keep a sick child alive. Before this story begins, stay until the very end to see how it unfolds. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The trading post sat where the territory ran out of names, a long plank building with a shake roof and a floor that groaned under every boot that crossed it. Kerosene lanterns hung from the crossbeams, throwing an amber, flickering light across bolts of cloth and tins of coffee and crates of tack that smelled of cured leather and road dust. At the back, near the stove, a woman had laid her scarves across a borrowed table as if she expected them to be handled roughly, and had already made peace with that. Noriko stood behind them with the kind of stillness that made people slow down without knowing why. Her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional Japanese knot, her almond-shaped dark eyes watching the room without moving. Her fair skin and high cheekbones caught the lantern light so it looked wrong for this place and right for somewhere far away. She wore a simple kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the only concession she had made to the frontier, and not one stitch of western cloth on her body. The town had decided what she was before she ever opened her mouth, and she had stopped trying to change their minds about it weeks ago. The scarves were the work that mattered. Some were chirimen, the silk crepe with the bumpy shibo texture that came from threads twisted thousands of times before the weave, soft and strong at once. Others were tsumugi, hand-spun from threads of different lengths and thicknesses, the kind of rustic weave that grew softer the longer someone wore it, the only cloth she knew that rewarded time instead of punishing it. A few carried yuzen work, patterns hand-painted onto the silk in persimmon and riverstone shades, each brushstroke set by hand and there to stay. Silk was the strongest natural textile in the world. No one in this room had any reason to know that, and fewer still had any interest in learning. Behind the counter, folded into a quilt, her son Kenji slept the way sick children sleep, shallow and restless, his breath catching every few seconds in a cough that had stopped sounding like a cough and started sounding like something else. She sold the scarves to buy the herbs that kept him breathing, dried roots and leaves she measured by fixed proportion and brewed into a tea bitter enough to make a grown man wince. The proportions weren't guesswork. They came from her grandmother, who came from her grandmother before her, a chain of women stretching back to a house in Kyoto where the loom and the medicine case had sat side by side. On the table, beside the scarves, sat a small lacquered box, shut, its clasp closed, its surface catching the lantern light like something that belonged in a temple and not on a frontier counter. She never opened it where anyone could see. When someone reached toward it, she moved her hand to cover it without looking up, a small gesture so automatic it had to be old, and the box held something she wasn't ready to show this town. Trade moved around her all day and never through her. Teamsters came in for flour and nails, ranch hands for tobacco and cartridges, and they passed her table the way you pass a post at the end of a hitching rail, something you register and dismiss in the same glance. A few slowed to look at the silk. None of them touched it after the first week, when a man had picked up a scarf and asked the price, heard it, and set it down again with the smile people use when they've decided a thing is a trick. She hadn't lowered the price since, and she wouldn't. The scarves cost what they cost because the work cost what it cost, and she would close the table before she sold her grandmother's patience for less than it was worth. By evening, the lanterns burned lower and the amber light thickened, and Kenji coughed once in his sleep and didn't wake. Noriko folded the unsold scarves back into their cloth, stacked them beside the lacquered box, and counted the coins in her palm. There were enough herbs for 3 more days. After that, the count would have to come from somewhere else, and she hadn't yet decided where. The town called her the Chinawoman. They said it the way you name a landmark you have no use for, flat and final, and no one who said it had any interest in being corrected. A shopkeeper once told a customer, loud enough for her to hear, that the Japanese were the same as the Chinese more or less, and the woman at the back table could be either, for all he cared. Noriko heard it. She didn't turn around. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to hear a stranger explain her to another stranger, and she had learned that correcting them changed nothing but the look on their faces. So she kept the look off her own and waited. Her dignity was the thing she guarded more than the silk. She never begged, never dropped her price, never explained the weave to someone who hadn't asked, and never once told the shopkeeper that her mother's people had been weaving silk in Kyoto since before his town existed. To beg would have been to confirm what they already believed, that she was here on their sufferance, and she would rather watch the scarf sit untouched than hand them that. So she sat and she waited, and the waiting was its own kind of work, the kind that costs you something every day and shows nothing for it. The trouble was the count. Her money was nearly gone. The Kampo herbs were down to the last measured portions in the lacquered medicine case, each one folded in paper and labeled in a hand smaller than the town could read, and 3 days had become 2. Kinji's cough had deepened into a sound that lived in his chest like a tenant, and the fever came back in the evenings now, a heat she could feel through the quilt before she put her hand to his forehead. He had days, not weeks, and the scarves that should have bought those days were still sitting on the table under amber light that no one had earned. A teamster came by that afternoon, a big man with tar on his cuffs, and he picked up a scarf and pulled it between his hands the way men test leather, looking for the give that means weakness. The silk didn't give. He pulled harder, expecting it to tear, like the cheap cloth he knew. It held, and something passed across his face that wasn't respect, but the unease of a man whose assumption had just cost him a guess. He dropped the scarf on the table and walked out without a word, and the scarf lay where it landed, undamaged, the weave as even as when she had finished it. She picked it up and folded it and set it back with the others, and her hands didn't shake. They had stopped shaking weeks ago, the way hands stop shaking when the person they belong to has already walked through the worst thing they can imagine and come out the other side still standing. This was the kind of calm that only comes from having accepted the worst possible outcome, and it was the only calm the frontier had ever given her. No one in the territory had any reason to help her, and most of them had a reason not to, because a woman alone with a sick child and something to sell was not a neighbor to them, but a problem that would solve itself if they waited long enough. She knew that. She had known it since the first week, when the wife of the feed store owner had looked at Kinji, and then at her, and then away, the way you look at a wound you don't intend to dress. The frontier wasn't cruel in the way people tell it. It was cruel in the way a closed door is, cruel, indifferent, and quiet and patient about it. That evening she measured the last of the herbs and brewed them and held Kinji's head while he drank, and he made the face children make when something is too bitter to bear, but they drink it anyway because their mother's hand is behind their head. She counted the coins again. 2 days. The scarves gleamed on the table in the low lantern light, worth more than anything else in the building and valued by no one in it, and outside the wind picked up and pushed dust against the shutters like a hand testing whether the door would hold. She had come too far to fold now, and she had nothing left to sell but the one thing she had sworn she would keep, the lacquered box she carried from Kyoto and never opened in public. That night she didn't open it. She put her hand on its lid instead, felt the lacquer smooth and cool under her palm, and made herself a promise she had no right to make, that she would find another way before she touched what was inside. The door opened the next afternoon and let in a slice of white dust and the silhouette of someone who filled the frame without trying. Buck walked in the way certain men walk into rooms, slow and sure, his boots finding the floor like they had a claim on it, his hat pushed back off a face that the sun had spent years rewriting. He was a rancher You could tell by the way he carried his hands, easy and ready, the hands of someone who measured his days in fence posts and cattle, and the work that doesn't care whether you feel like doing it. He moved past the feed counter, past the corner table where two old men played cards, past the stone fireplace that hadn't been lit since the cold broke, and then his gaze locked on the back table where the silk lay. He didn't hurry. He crossed to it the way you cross to something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking, and he stopped in front of the scarves and didn't speak. Noriko watched him the way she watched everyone, without moving, her hands flat on the table, one resting on the scarves and the other near the lacquered box. He reached for a chirimen scarf, the one with the shibo texture, and ran it through his fingers the way he would run a length of rain through his hands, feeling for the lie in it, the weakness, the place where the work gives out. He didn't find it. He held the silk up to the lantern light and turned it, and the light came through the weave as cheap cloth never allows, and his face changed in the small way a face changes when a man stops testing something and starts wanting it. He set that scarf down and picked up a tsumugi one, the hand-spun one, and his thumb found the texture where the threads of different thicknesses met, and he looked at it longer than any person in the territory had looked at her work. Then he did the thing no one had done. He counted out coins, full price, the price she had asked and never lowered, and he laid them on the table, one at a time, not for one scarf, but for the lot, every scarf she had, the whole table. He didn't haggle, and he didn't ask for a deal for buying them all. He counted out what they were worth as if he knew what they were worth, and when the last coin landed, he left the scars where they lay. Noriko had watched men buy things all her life, and she had never seen a man buy a thing and leave it behind. She looked at the coins, then at the scars, then at him, and the question she didn't ask sat between them like a third person at the table. He met her eyes, and what he asked instead was the thing no one in 300 miles had thought to ask. "What's your name?" she told him. "Noriko." She said it once, and he said it back to her as if he were learning it, and in the saying it became a different word than the one the town had been using for her, a word with a person attached to it instead of a label. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and walked out the way he had come, slow and sure, and the door closed behind him, and the dust settled, and the room was quiet. For the first time since she had arrived in this territory, a wall came down between two people. It was not love, and it was not trust, and it was not even the beginning of a plan. It was a recognition. Two people who had both learned what it cost to stand alone, seeing each other clearly for the first time across a table of silk that one of them had made and the other had just bought and left behind. She stayed at the table after he left, her hand still resting on the scarves he had bought and left, and she let herself feel the thing she had been refusing to feel for weeks, which was that someone had seen her work and valued it and hadn't tried to take it for less. The coins sat in a row where he had placed them. There were enough of them to buy the herbs for a month, maybe two, and for the first time the count wasn't a countdown. She didn't know why a stranger would buy silk. He didn't take and ask a name he didn't need, and the not knowing was the first thing in this territory that had made her curious instead of merely careful. He came back. Not the next day, and not with promises, but 3 days later, with a sack of flour on his shoulder that he set beside her table without explanation and walked out again before she could refuse it. The week after that, he brought firewood, split clean and stacked straight, the kind of work that tells you more about a man than his words ever will. Then a bolt of undyed cotton, then a tin of honey, then a bag of dried apples, and each time he stayed a little longer and said a little less, until the silence between them had become the most comfortable silence she had found since leaving Kyoto. The courtship, if you could call it that, had no speeches in it. He would sit on the stool by her table in the afternoons and watch her work the loom she had set up behind the counter, the small folding loom she had carried across the ocean wrapped in oilcloth, and he watched the way a man watches weather, not to understand it, but to know what is coming. She didn't perform for him. She threaded the shuttle and threw it and beat the weft, and the rhythm of it was the rhythm of every room she had ever worked in, and he didn't ask her to explain it. She didn't offer. This was the breathing room, the stretch of quiet after the weeks of dread, and she let it breathe because she had learned that peace on the frontier is a thing you take when it comes and don't question. Kenji's cough had eased with the herbs Buck's coins had bought, and he would sit on the quilt and watch the shuttle move and sometimes sleep. And for a few afternoons the trading post held nothing worse than dust and amber light and the soft clatter of the loom. One evening he stayed past the lantern light when the post had emptied and the card players had gone, and the only sound was the stove settling and the silk whispering under her hands. She had decided something. She reached for the lacquered box and set it on the table between them and opened it slowly, the way you open a thing that has been closed a long time. Inside, fitted into the silk lining, were her grandmother's tools, the shuttles and bobbins, and the small bone shuttle she had been given when she was 9 years old, the ones she had carried out of Kyoto when there was nothing else left to carry. She told him, in a few words, where she had learned and who had taught her, and what she had lost between that house and this table. He had not expected that. He looked at the tools the way he had looked at the silk, with the attention of someone who knows what it costs to keep a thing alive, and he didn't say he was sorry for her, because she hadn't asked him to be sorry. She told him, almost to herself, that the tsumugi was the weave that softened the longer it was worn, the only cloth that repaid time, and she said it the way you say a thing you've just realized is also about something else. He heard it and didn't answer it. He sat with her while she closed the box again, and the not answering was its own kind of answer, and the evening held them both without requiring either of them to name what was building. The days lengthened after that, or they seemed to, and the table that had been a kind of exile began to feel like a place she had chosen. He brought Kenji a carved wooden horse he had made with his knife, not a toy from a store, but a thing shaped by hand, and the boy held it and didn't cough for an hour, and Noriko watched her son hold a stranger's gift and felt the careful wall she had built around her hope develop a crack she didn't try to repair. She had sworn she wouldn't need anyone in this territory. The swear was getting harder to keep, and she was no longer sure she wanted to keep it, and that was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she arrived. She didn't call it courtship because the word was too soft for what it was and too hard for what it wasn't. It was two people building a shared habit out of small actions, the flour and the firewood and the carved horse and the afternoons at the loom, and the habit was growing into something neither of them had named because naming it too early was the way you broke things on the frontier. So they didn't name it. They let it grow the way the tsumugi softened, and they waited to see what it became. The quiet broke on an afternoon when the door banged open, and two ranch hands carried in a third between them, a young man with his arm wrapped in a rag that had gone from white to brown to the color of old rust. The town doctor was already there, already shaking his head, already saying the words that frontier doctors say when they have run out of what they know, that the arm was going bad and the fever with it, and there was nothing left but to take it off above the elbow, and pray the man lived through the taking. The young man heard him and went gray, and the room went the kind of quiet that comes when everyone agrees on a thing no one wants to say. Noriko stood up. The room turned. Not to help, but to watch, the way a room watches a fire, and she crossed to the young man with the second case in her hand, the lacquered medicine case she had never opened in front of any of them. She knelt beside him and unwound the rag, and the wound was worse than the rag, hot and swollen and traced with the red lines that mean the body is losing the argument. She didn't ask permission, but opened the case and laid out the fine needles, so thin they caught no light, and a row of paper packets of dried roots and leaves, each one measured and folded by the proportions her grandmother had fixed 100 years before her. Buck was there. He had come in behind the hands, and he stood at the edge of the room and watched her work, and what he watched wasn't the foreignness of it, but the precision, the way her hands moved without hurry and without waste, The way a man moves who has done a hard thing so many times the hands remember it without the mind. She cleaned the wound with a brew she made from the first packet, laid 3 needles along the arm where the red lines ran, and measured a second packet into a cup of hot water and held it to the young man's lips. He drank, and his face twisted at the bitterness, and she held the cup steady and waited. The fever broke before morning. The arm stayed. The town doctor looked at the wound the next day and said nothing, which was the loudest thing he had said in years. The young man sat up and thanked the Japanese woman in a voice that shook, because he had come within a night of losing his arm to a doctor who had given up and a woman who hadn't. The town didn't embrace her after that. Acceptance on the frontier isn't a door that opens. It is a wall that develops a crack, and the crack was there now where there had been none, and the people who had called her the China woman still called her that, but said it quieter, the way you say a thing you're no longer sure of. The young man was one of Buck's own hands, which meant the arm she saved belonged to one of the men who worked Buck's fence line. Buck's quiet gratitude and the town's grudging recognition arrived in the same week and pulled in different directions. She felt both. She felt the way the feed store wife looked at her now, not away, but at a look that had curiosity in it instead of pity, and she felt the trading post owner looking at her differently too. His name was Holt, and he kept the books on every stall and every dead in the building, and the look on his face wasn't respect. It was the look of someone who has just realized he's been sitting on a thing he undervalued, and she had learned to read the faces in this territory the way she read a weave by where the tension sat. She had proven what Buck already knew, that her worth wasn't in the silk alone, but in the hands that made it, and the proving changed the count of the days ahead. It also changed something more dangerous. A curiosity can be ignored. A woman who can save an arm the doctor couldn't is worth too much to leave alone, and on the frontier, the worth keeping aren't left alone. They're owned or they're fought over, and the crack in the wall had let in the kind of attention she had spent weeks trying to avoid. Holt came to her table 3 days after the arm healed, and he came the way someone comes when he has done the numbers and liked them. He was a tall man, soft in the middle, with the clean hands of someone who had made his living off other people's work, and he sat on Buck's stool without asking, and folded his hands on the table and smiled the smile of a man about to offer you a kindness you'll pay for the rest of your life. He told her he had been watching her and that the stall was wasted on a plank table. A woman with her skill and her medicine ought to have a proper shop, a sign, a stock of supplies, and he was the man who could front her all of it. Scorty. He would set her up, she would weave and heal, he would keep the books and take his share, and he named a share that left her barely enough to feed the boy, let alone buy the herbs. She listened without moving, and she listened to everything, and when he finished, she told him no. She said it once, flat, the way she said the price of the scarves, and she didn't explain it, because there was nothing to explain that he would hear. She would rather sell silk from a borrowed table than sell herself from a shop with his name on the books, and the no was the kind that doesn't negotiate, and he heard it and stopped smiling. The retaliation came the way. It always comes from men who keep the books quietly and on paper. He called in the debt on her lodging, a debt she hadn't known she owed, because the post owner had never mentioned it, and he gave her 3 days to pay it or take the child and the table and the loom out to the road. The same day, the day the notice was nailed to the post beside her table, Kenji's fever spiked again, a hard, sudden heat that came on by noon and left him shaking under the quilt. She opened the medicine case and found the packets thinner than she had reckoned, the last of the herbs, measured down to days she didn't have. She was out of money, and out of herbs, and out of time, and all 3 ran out in the same hour, which is the way the frontier ends things. For people who have refused to bend, Holt sent 2 men that evening, not to hurt her, but to clear the table, to stack the scarves and the loom and the quilt and set them on the road, and they came in with the quiet efficiency of men doing a job they've been paid to do. They reached for the table. One of them reached for the quilt where Kenji lay burning with fever, and that was the line she had drawn in her mind the day she arrived, the line she would hold with whatever she had. She didn't shout. She stepped back to the wall where the naginata hung, the long curved blade on its lacquered shaft that she had carried out of Kyoto beside the thread box and mounted above her sleeping place the way another woman would mount a rifle. She took it down and turned and stood between the men and her son, and the blade came up slow and steady, and the light caught the edge of it and made the two men stop where they stood. They hadn't expected a weapon, and they hadn't expected her to know what to do with one. The tall one looked at the blade and looked at her face and saw the kind of calm that comes only from having already decided what you're willing to do, and he put his hand on his partner's arm and they backed out the way they had come, and the door closed and the room was hers again. She didn't lower the blade for a long time. She stood with her back to the wall and her son behind her and the naginata across the doorway, and she breathed, and the breathing was the first thing she had allowed herself in weeks. The threat wasn't over. Holt would come back with the law behind him, with a deed and a county warrant, and the kind of right that paper gives a man over a woman with no paper of her own, and she couldn't fight a warrant with a blade. But for that one evening the table was intact, and the boy was breathing, and the silk was still on it, and she held the line, because holding it was the only thing left that she could do. Buck rode in the next morning with the dust still on him, and the news already in his face, because word travels in a small town the way fire travels in dry grass, and he had heard what Holt had done before she could tell him. He didn't make a speech. He dismounted and walked into the post and looked at the notice nailed to the wall beside her table, and read it, and then he looked at her, and the looking was enough. He asked her one thing, whether she wanted him to handle it with paper or with his hands, and she told him paper, because she had come too far to be saved by a fist fight, and she wanted whatever came next to be the kind that lasts. He rode out, and he rode hard, and he was gone 2 days. And in those 2 days, Holt came back. He came with a county warrant, and a man in a badge, and the slow certainty of a person who has the law on his side and knows it, and he stood in front of her table and read out the debt and the eviction, and gave her until sundown to take her things and her child and go. The room filled. People came to watch the way they come to watch a hanging, not to stop it, but to see it done, and Noriko stood behind her table with Kenji on her hip and the lacquered box under one arm, and felt the wall of the room close in to the width of the table. Then the door opened, and Buck walked in, and he wasn't alone. He had a paper in his hand, a deed, recorded at the county seat 2 days' ride south, and the deed was to a parcel of land outside town that Holt had no claim to and no reach into. He walked past the man in the badge and past Holt, and stood between them and Noriko. And he didn't raise his voice, because the facts were already doing the work, and the facts didn't need his help. "That's my wife." The room went still. It wasn't true. Not yet, not on any paper, but it was the truth he had been walking toward for weeks, and he said it the way you say a thing you mean, once, and let it stand. He set the deed on the table beside the silk and told Holt and the man in the badge that the woman and the child lived on his land, now that her name was going on the deed before the week was out, and that the debt on a stall in a building she no longer occupied was a debt Holt could collect from the wind. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The deed was the threat, and the law, for once, was on the side of the woman with no paper of her own. Holt looked at the deed and looked at Buck and did the arithmetic he was born to do, and the arithmetic told him that a fight over a stall wasn't worth the rancher who owned the ground outside town and the hands who worked it. And he took his warrant and his badge and his smile and left. The room stayed full for a moment longer, and then it emptied the way a room empties when there's nothing left to watch, and Noriko was left standing behind a table of silk she still owned, on ground she was about to own, beside a man who had just called her his wife in front of the whole town without asking her first. She didn't correct him. She looked at the deed, and then at him, and then at the boy on her hip, and the not correcting was its own kind of answer, the kind that doesn't need a word because the word has already been spoken and the person it was spoken about has decided to let it be true. They married before the month was out, not in a church with a sermon, but in the yard of the ranch house, with the deed already carrying both their names and the county man reading the words once, and no one needing to hear them twice. It was a quiet thing, the kind of wedding the frontier allows, witnessed by the hands who worked the fence line and the feed store wife who had finally decided to look at her instead of away, and Buck said his piece and Noriko said hers, and neither of them said more than the moment required. The fever broke for good a week before the wedding, under the last course of the herbs Buck had ridden 2 days south to bring back, the kind of errand a man runs without being asked when the child on his land is the child he has decided is his. Kenji sat up and ate and didn't cough, and the first thing he did with his strength was pick up the carved wooden horse and hold it out to Buck. And Buck took it and set it on the shelf beside the rifle and said nothing, and the nothing was full. The ranch house changed around her, the way a room changes when the right person moves into it. Not all at once, but by degrees. A corner by the window became her loom, the folding loom unfolded now and dressed with a fresh warp, and the lacquered thread box sat open on the shelf for the first time since Kyoto. The shuttles and bobbins in their places where she could see them and where they could be seen. Above the door, where another man would hang a rifle, she hung the naginata, the long blade on its lacquered shaft, and Buck looked at it and looked at her and didn't ask her to take it down, because he understood that a woman who had held a line alone doesn't put down the thing that held it with her. The scarves, the ones he had bought and left on the table that first afternoon, became the first stock of a workshop that sold to the whole territory, and the people who had let them sit untouched for weeks came to her now on their own, not because she was one of them, but because the silk was what it was and the word had traveled. She didn't need them to understand her. She needed them to buy good silk, and they did, and the buying was a kind of respect the town could manage, even when the rest of it was beyond them. 2 cultures lived under the one roof and didn't always agree, and the town still got her name wrong sometimes, calling her what they had always called her when they weren't thinking. She let it pass the way she let the dust pass, because a name isn't the thing that makes a home. What made the home was the loom in the corner, and the blade above the door, and the boy who slept without coughing, and the man who came in at dusk and set his boots on the porch and said her name, her real name, every time he crossed the threshold, as if he were still learning it and wanted to get it right. She hadn't been rescued. That was the thing she would have said if anyone had asked, and no one did. The people who watched the story from the outside saw a cowboy who saved a widow and missed the part where she saved herself first every day for weeks before he ever walked through the door. What Buck gave her wasn't rescue but ground, a piece of earth with her name on it, and what she gave him was the craft to make something of it. The two together, the ground and the craft, became a future that neither of them could have built alone. Respect, not rescue, was what had made a family out of 2 strangers and a boy and a table of silk, and the respect had gone both ways from the first afternoon he paid full price and left the scarves behind. The first order came in that fall, a request for a dozen scarves from a dry goods store 2 territories over, a place that had heard of her work the way good work travels, by mouth and by touch, and by the slow reputation of a thing that does what it claims. She dressed the loom for the new bolt and sat down to it, and the shuttle began to move, and the rhythm was the rhythm of every room she had ever worked in. This room was different. It had a boy sleeping easy in the corner, and a man's boots on the porch, and a blade above the door, and a box open on the shelf, and for the first time in a long time, the count of the days wasn't a countdown but a beginning. The last evening light caught the open lacquered box, and the boy asleep and breathing easy. And outside the boots on the porch, went quiet as the man who wore them listened for the shuttle before he came in. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The silk doesn't say whether a place becomes home or you just build one strong enough to stop asking. It only keeps softening the longer you wear it.